Hello and welcome to another Fully Charged podcast. This week's guest is someone who's been on the show before, a man I met in Sydney, Australia many years ago. Ketan Joshi is an energy analyst, an energy specialist. He really knows his energy systems. He now lives in Oslo with his wife and two children, and he works for the European Climate Foundation. You'll hear what he's studying. It's really clever stuff. And my frustration is that Ketan is not in Sydney for the Fully Charged live show. He actually is coming to Australia about 3 weeks later. It's just timing, isn't it? It's just not fair. So I'm not going to see him, and he's not going to be there this year, but hopefully either he'll be in Sydney next year or he'll be at the Amsterdam show. He might be in one of the UK shows. Really trying to get him along because he's such an extraordinary fountain of knowledge about the energy industry. So I just want to quickly mention that for Australian listeners. Fully Charged Live is in Darling Harbour in Sydney at the Exhibition Centre on the 11th and 12th of March, and it is just going to be spectacular. Just had two more confirmations in the last 24 hours of really big companies that are putting on huge displays there. It is a very, very exciting show. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the energy transition with Ketan Joshi.
Ketan, so good to see you. This is a kind of reversal, because I think one of the last times we recorded stuff, I was in Europe and you were in Australia. I can't even remember. Anyway, I'm now in Australia. I'm in your country and you're in Norway, which is only mildly confusing.
Yes, I know. I hope you're having a good time.
I am having a very good time. I'm a little bit clammy at the moment because it's been a very hot day here today.
Yeah.
It will be tomorrow. I'd love to quickly catch up with what you're up to, because the European Climate Foundation. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious from the title what that is. I can work that out. So have you just started working? Have you started working for them fairly recently?
Yeah, so midway through last year is when I sort of officially started. I did a little bit of work here and there with them before. And what I have been brought on to do is I focus on corporate net zero targets, which is really, really fun. Basically, companies, you would have seen this all over the place, right? Like when you walk through the aisle in a supermarket, you see carbon neutral baby food or, we're going to be net zero by 20 whatever. And you sort of people would be very familiar with the concept of net zero, particularly around like government commitments. The UK government, the German government, etc. Australia recently enshrined a net zero commitment into law, which is sort of meaningful, but sort of not. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later.
Yeah.
And corporations really have not been doing a very good job on net zero.
Right.
They have been making a lot of targets, a lot of commitments. But it hasn't really been manifesting as real world, like reduced emissions, which is exactly, we need to, be reducing emissions quite quickly right now. And there's a whole host of reasons, which I won't go into, but they're very interesting and very fun. And I have been personally focusing on carbon offsets and carbon removal,
right?
Which is basically when a company says, we're just going to emit, but we're going to somehow cancel it out afterwards.
Yes.
And then, which, is on shaky ground. And then the other thing I've been focusing on, which I've just, I've been doing for years now, which I just absolutely love, is focusing on fossil fuel companies. And particularly when the fossil fuel companies say, look at us, we're doing the right thing. We've made some amazing commitment. We're investing in renewables, trying to tease apart when sometimes there's actually a bit of veracity to what they're saying, and teasing apart also when it sounds pretty believable even to people who kind of know the field, but then you dig even slightly into it and you're like, oh right, okay. So yeah, those are my two obsessions at the moment.
Right. I mean, that's absolutely critically important, and also hugely hard to understand if you're outside that world. I mean, it cannot fail to sound like a con job. We're burning all these fossil fuels, but we've paid a farmer at the other side of the world to plant 19 trees. And then you find out he'd already planted them. They're already growing there. or they plant 19 trees in the desert where they've got zero chance of living.
I can give you the 30-second explanation if you want for people, for your listeners who may be a bit baffled by the entire thing. I totally understand. So basically, the fundamental concept, like I just said, is that you can emit and then somehow neutralize or offset or cancel it out. So sometimes it's referring to a physical cancelling out of what you've done, which is you've added a greenhouse gas into the atmosphere or the oceans. And other times it's actually referring to a weird, funky moral neutralization of what you've done. So like you're basically requesting forgiveness and balancing out your moral ledger with, I guess, the atmosphere. And if that sounds weird, it's because it is weird. So basically 90% of any offsets that you see claimed anywhere, 90 to 95%, if you look at a carbon neutral claim, or if you look at a company or even a country, 90 to 95% of those offsets are actually from what we call avoided emissions, right? So I'm Ketan, I build a coal-fired power station, I emit 1 ton, and then I pay someone else who also owns a coal-fired power station, for instance, who insists that they were planning to release a ton to not do that. So the end result for the atmosphere, the end result for the atmosphere is that I've added a ton into the atmosphere. Someone else who was going to didn't, but there's still a net addition into the atmosphere, which is awful, right? Like that's what causes global warming, is that we keep piling more and more on top of the stock that's already in the atmosphere, and that's what heats Earth. So now what the confusion is intentional, right? So if your listeners are like, every time I see this, my brain melts, it's that is by design, because what people want is for you to be confused about what's known as removal, which is when you actually physically put your hand into the atmosphere and take a ton out, and then you bury it back underground, or you mineralize it in some concrete or something like that, right? You've actually taken something out of you've intervened in the atmosphere and you've taken something out, which is actually not the worst thing to do, right? I mean, there's a lot of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere. We want to try and remove it where we can. But then there's a whole host of problems with that, because, you can't then go, well, I removed it, so I may as well just add one back in, because then nothing's changed. You can't also, you can't then remove that ton and go, oh, look, I've got this great little ton of carbon here. I'm going to use it to dislodge some oil from some reservoirs, which is what the majority of carbon captured using CCS is used for. So that's basically CCS is when you capture it as you release it, whereas carbon removal is like putting a big fan up in
sucking out the air,
that sucks it from the atmosphere. So basically, all of this adds up into this system where a company can go, look, we've emitted, but we've also paid someone who said they were going to emit to not emit. Therefore, we've kind of like cancelled out the wrongdoing by doing an act of charity towards someone else. Like, somehow it's as if we're not emitting at all. And that's been the logic of this entire system of carbon markets for decades now. And it's become so normalized that we've forgotten how absurd and comical the entire situation is. And of course, on top of how funny it is, like, it's also very bad for emissions, right? Because of course you end up with this situation where people just keep emitting because they're like, well, no one's really yelling at us for it because we said we offset it. So we're just going to keep doing it. So basically, so you're in Australia, right? Like, just yesterday and the day before, there have been some announcements about climate policy. And the big problem with both of those announcements is that they have basically given a green light to corporations using as many offsets as they please when trying to meet emissions reductions targets, right? So the new government, not bad, they're like, they have the right idea generally. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty of their policies, there's a huge number of flaws. And one of the biggest ones is they're allowing too many carbon offsets to be claimed. So a company will kind of just go, look, we're meeting your mandatory climate policy, but all that they're really doing is paying for a bunch of offsets that may or may not be avoiding emissions and are certainly not removing any emissions. So it's not it's a real mess, and the best way to fix it is to basically force companies to have a really hard limit on how many offsets they can use, right? So it's like only 5% or less of your emissions can you address using offsets. So that's I hope that explanation makes sense.
No, it makes a bit more sense. And I mean, also presumably part and parcel of that is to encourage them to emit less right at the beginning, as in just don't do as much, don't burn as much stuff as you're burning. Do everything you can to reduce that, I guess, is a equally important part of it.
So the really key issue here, right, is that when people talk about offsets, they're like, no, Ketan, stop being cynical and judgmental. What they're really used for is actually only for the stuff that's very hard to abate, right? Like a helicopter that is used by a hospital. There's no electric alternative that you can charge on renewables for, and it's also socially critical, right? Like, like, how dare you criticize offsets? Because they're going to be used. Like, do you hate people using ambulance helicopters, or whatever, right? And then basically, of course, when you look at who's buying offsets, look at how they're used, how they're marketed. Of course, they're used for like Bitcoin and NFTs and coal-fired power stations and like like car loans and stuff that is like at the absolute other opposite end of being, first of all, easy to abate, and secondly, generally not socially critical, right? So not stuff that we would say like, because this is so important to society, we're not going to like burden it with the challenge of technological, like say electrification, for instance, like the ambulance helicopter example. So the main justification is ridiculous, right? Like it's just a few weeks ago, one of my good friends in Australia, Polly Hemming, she works for the Australian Institute, and she does fantastic work on offsetting and stuff like that. If any of your listeners want to look her up her work. But she posted this Australian government certification that was just granted to British American Tobacco, who are now carbon neutral.
Wow,
hooray.
That is unbelievable. Wow.
Yeah, so you can kind of see how like the system of just cheap offsets that are just generated from the imagination of like all these people who are like, I was definitely going to emit and I'm not going to anymore. And they sell these really cheap offsets, and all these companies are just like, yeah, cool, why not? It's like, very cheap. This is a real, what happens is that, say a car company, for instance, which has the option to start, building electric models or even, electrifying their manufacturing facilities or something like that. They may go, well, why would we bother, when we can just buy some offsets and we get the same like hit from our public relations team who are like, we're carbon neutral. When you buy this particular model of car, it was produced using a carbon neutral process. Whereas in reality, what they should be doing is actually significantly reducing their emissions as soon as possible. It's a real problem.
And I mean, is the European Climate Foundation, is that a kind of a European Union funded organization? Is that how it works?
So it's a mix of funding sources, like it's partly philanthropic. It's a re-granting agency, but what I do is actually I work in the strategic communications element of it, right? So we sort of just like plan, like some projects. We do a bit of research. We do also a bit of like informational stuff, helping like journalists and the general public understand some of these issues. It's a real mix of things that we do, but we're kind of constantly buffeted by all of these different like elements that are coming out all the time, because it's just like
Yeah.
at the COP last year, the United Nations did a really good report on this. So there was this group called, they give really bad names to all these groups. This was the High Level Expert Working Group on Net Zero Commitments, and then there was some extra words in there that I've just rejected from my mind because I can't be bothered storing that information. But basically, they came up with a whole bunch of recommendations on how to deal with these targets. So we were really interested in that, and we kind of helped people understand what those recommendations meant and stuff like that. It's really people, even when you get like a straightforward investigation into this type of thing or a straightforward report, it's still confusing because it's just fundamentally a concept that is just not familiar. People can understand something like a coal-fired power station emitting, but the sort of the mathematics, like the addition and the subtraction of the ledger of emissions, it's just such a total mess. And as I mentioned before, it's been made that way, so consumers get a bit dazzled and confused by the whole thing.
I mean, but one of the things you mentioned in that which is I'm also confused about, because I cannot quite understand whether it actually happens, and it is actually happening, is carbon capture and storage, so CCS, which is bandied about very liberally by fuel companies, fossil fuel industry, car manufacturing in general, power generation in particular. And I have not yet, I mean, I might be ignorant, but I've visited power stations in the past where they were going to install CCS equipment. And I know they haven't. And I'm talking 18 years ago, they told me that. And they still haven't done it. So, I mean, is anyone actually doing it? Is anyone actually capturing the carbon that they're producing and storing it in any way? I mean, that is happening in the world somewhere.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I'm glad you've asked me about CCS.
Right.
So basically, the one thing that I wrote last year, so, a son, he was born in October 2021. He's great. He's fantastic. He's a wonderful little dude, but he does not sleep. One consequence of that, is that I've had to dedicate 100% of my whatever skerricks of remaining cognitive capacity I have to my actual day job, and so I haven't written a lot the past year and a half. It's really
very understandable.
Upsetting. I want to write a lot more this year. Anyway, he's starting to sleep a bit better. But one thing I did write last year is I contributed a short essay to Greta Thunberg's book, The Climate Book.
Great!
Which was released a few months ago. And they asked me to write about CCS, so I've written a few essays before that about CCS. And one dynamic that so I've seen a lot of criticism of CCS as fundamentally not a very good technology, right? There's been a lot of research, as in actual good published research, as to why the technology itself has not really manifested the way it was promised. So go back in time 2 decades, and you've got the head of the Australian Coal Association saying that by 2020, there's no reason why a quarter of total global emissions could not be avoided by CCS. And this was, I think he said that in 2006 or something. And of course, you look at the data in 2020, and it was something like 0.04% of potential emissions being captured before it's added into the atmosphere by CCS, right? So 25% versus 0.04%. I would call that a failure. But basically, what I was interested in is why, if it continues to fail, if the actual technology keeps not really manifesting, why does it dominate corporate announcements, government announcements? Why is it getting so much cash? Continually getting a huge amount of cash, from governments, subsidies. Why does this keep happening? And so what I did was I spent a bit of time reading basically what fossil fuel companies were saying about CCS. And the one dynamic that kept coming up is that it was always about the promise of CCS and never about its real world manifestation. So they were never like, hold us to account. We're definitely going to have a CCS plant in the next 2 years, and if we don't, fine us X number of dollars, right? The only time that anyone has actually been held to account on the construction of a CCS facility is in Australia. In Western Australia, there's a gas production facility operated by Chevron called Gorgon. And Gorgon is a total disaster. Basically, they were given targets by the Western Australian Environmental Protection Authority, and they've completely missed all of these carbon capture targets. A huge volume of emissions has been added into the atmosphere that should have been captured by their gas processing facility. So one important thing to note here is that there's no combustion here. Like basically they're taking gas out of the ground. There's a whole bunch of carbon dioxide mixed up in that. And then they kind of separate it out. And normally they would just like release that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Right.
And they're capturing it now. And they're like, look, we deserve so much credit for capturing this instead of just, releasing it into the atmosphere, which is ridiculous. They should just be forced to do it. They shouldn't, basically what happened when they missed all their targets is the government said, look, we're very disappointed in you. You've missed all of your carbon capture targets. And Chevron were like, well, it's okay. If you want to punish us, you can just ask us to buy some offsets. And guess what happened?
Right.
They have purchased carbon offsets for avoided emissions, not for removals, for the amount that they have failed to capture using CCS. So this keeps happening around the world. There's a really good report by IEFA, who have that acronym stands for something that I don't remember any of the words. I think the first word is
international.
The F might be finance, something.
Right.
But they're very good, and they have a good report on CCS. And I wrote a follow-up on my blog if anyone wants to read it, just like 1 year on from that Greta Thunberg piece. Basically just reanalyzing the latest data that came out from the Global CCS Institute. And the majority of new CCS projects, so there's a big flurry of new CCS projects, right?
Right.
Last time this happened, most of them just evaporated. Most of them never became realized as real CCS things. The ones that did are not operating properly. They're not capturing enough, like Gorgon. And the ones that are capturing properly, the carbon they capture tends to be used to get injected into depleted oil reservoirs to dislodge any remaining oil, which of course get extracted and burned. Yeah. So it's not a good situation for CCS. However, when it comes to most of the new projects, actually most of them are power. And when you look at the history of CCS, power projects are the ones that have failed the most badly.
Oh God! Because the thing is, Ketan, just let me say that every time you bring up a slightly new topic, I think, "Oh, this is the one that worked," and every time you then explain no, this is the one that really didn't work.
It's the worst one. Yeah. The promise was always like clean coal. Like you go back to even like progressive politicians in Australia and like the sort of early 2010s were really talking up clean coal. You got like projections like 20% of Australia's power will be clean coal by 2020, that sort of stuff. And of course, nothing for coal and CCS, nothing's worked. For gas, maybe like some very limited potential, but it's pretty unlikely. And of course, gas has competition now from battery storage systems, from a bunch of other clean alternatives. And it's really starting to get squeezed because even its little niche that it could offer of being like a fast response, like gap filler for wind and solar, that's under threat now. So it's actually probably, and of course, gas has become so much more expensive. So the idea of building a gas plant with CCS is just not financially particularly viable anymore. So my theory basically is that CCS has a use, but that use is to allow fossil fuel projects to be approved. The use is an empty promise about the future. It's being used nefariously. And people object to that on the grounds of like, no, Ketan, like you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like CCS has all this potential. And it's like, I'm sure it does, like particularly in industry, like so say cement production, for instance, it
Yeah.
has a lot of potential. Like so here in Norway, of course, like I'm sitting in Norway that has probably the best deployment of CCS to date. Like there has been successful capture of
Oh, right.
carbon
Okay.
from and these are all from gas processing facilities, right? So like I mentioned with
Right.
Gorgon, you kind of take the carbon that comes up and you store it somewhere, right? So
Right.
even actually to their credit, a few Norwegian facilities are actually storing it underground successfully. However, remains a very, very, very tiny fraction of the total
Right.
emissions from these facilities, and because of the massive increase in oil and gas price from the past couple of years, actually what's happening is production is increasing, and the CCS, they're not building any new CCS for any of these things, right? So
Right.
and they have a limited capacity, so the proportion captured in Norway is decreasing relative to the rise in
Right.
emissions from increased oil and gas production.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
so if anyone wants to, borrow that book, I tell the story of like the history of CCS in Norway.
Right.
There was this huge thing about this is our moonshot. This is like we're gonna
Right.
go hard on CCS, and even then, even with Norway's like partial success, the majority of those ambitions were never realized.
Right. Right.
It remains very prominent. Even the past few days, we've seen like an agreement between Germany and Norway to produce hydrogen from methane, but
Yeah.
to capture the emissions in the process of doing so using CCS.
Right.
And they're building new gas-fired power stations in Germany, right?
Right.
Which is not good. I think the
No.
promise, of course, is like the promise has two edges to it. One is, don't worry, we'll use CCS,
Yeah.
and we'll convert them to hydrogen in the
Right.
future, some unspecified date in the future.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
CCS is playing, I would argue, a bad role at the moment.
Yeah.
It could switch to a good
Oh, I
role,
mean,
and I'll be happy to acknowledge when it does.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's because I get very confused with the colors of hydrogen. So what color
Oh
hydrogen
my
is
gosh.
it if you extract it from methane, but you capture the CCS? That's probably, I don't know what it is. It's not green. I know what green
It,
is. It's not blue. I don't think. I think it's probably grey. I don't know.
I think blue refers to hydrogen produced with methane, but with carbon capture and storage,
With
with
carbon.
some
Okay, so it's
proportion of
blue
emissions
hydrogen.
captured.
Yeah.
Well, there's emissions from many other points in the process that don't really get captured underneath the
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
underneath
sure.
the
No,
CCS
absolutely.
facility. So
Because it is.
yeah,
I mean, I think what I love how once you've kind of looked at a topic like the energy market and the automotive industry as well. I mean, those are the two that I'm sort of focused on. You start to then perceive waves of information that
yeah.
come out, and they diminish and they disappear. Like hydrogen, 4 years ago, no one was even talking about it. I mean, no one mentioned hydrogen was gone. Forget it. And now it's come back big time, really, really, really big. And I think
Oh my
it
gosh,
does
yeah.
correlate. It correlates with the cost, the increased deployment of renewables and the lowering of cost of renewables. Then the fossil fuel industry go, we've got to do something and we've got to do it fast. Hydrogen is going to be absolutely everything's hydrogen. It'll all be hydrogen cars, hydrogen ships, hydrogen planes. It's all good. Forget it. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Here, buy some diesel.
So, so this is something that I haven't really I want to write about a bit more. But something I find a bit fascinating is the whole push to put hydrogen into gas networks,
Yeah,
and particularly the whole like interplay between attacks on electrification of
yeah,
homes, and the alternative pathway of like no, don't worry, we can blend it with a small fraction of hydrogen, and then
yeah,
eventually we can convert all the pipes to hydrogen and convert all the appliances to hydrogen. And there's that community, I think, in the UK,
yeah.
or like that little town. I forget what it's called. And
Yeah, I can't
it's
remember. It's in
it's
the
just a
north of
bit of
England.
a It's just a bit of a mess, I think, if I
it
last
is a
time I
bit of a
checked.
mess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the main point of it is that the residents who live there are extremely unhappy with the way this has panned out and how it's been foisted on them. They didn't want it, and also it doesn't work. And it's
Oh
it
gosh,
is
yeah,
just
that's horrible.
it's
So
it's
it's worth
yeah
noting, though, like the similarity there with the CCS thing, because the fundamental
yeah
dynamic is, um, so something I've just been the past sort of 2 or 3 years, I've just been completely obsessed with, like the core story of what I hope has been leading my work has been what are the characteristics of climate delay today? Like, what's the
yeah
contemporary way that fossil fuel companies and others are trying to delay climate action? And so this whole story of like something that kind of looks like it's the right thing and might
yeah
sort of sound like it to somebody who doesn't have the time or the knowledge to sit down and learn about it,
yeah
that is really insidious. Because what
yeah
happens, so whether it's carbon offsets or CCS or hydrogen,
yeah
what happens is if you criticize it, they can kind of go, oh, well, you're kind of just being a curmudgeon. Like you're kind of just
yeah
being like, you're kind of just being overly cynical or critical when you should be optimistic or hopeful.
yes
And
yeah
of course, I would argue that the optimistic or hopeful approach is to analyze with like an evidence based perspective what is going on. Is it
yeah
actually doing the thing that gives us hope, which is a reduction in emissions and less climate impacts? Like that is fundamentally what should be giving us hope. And of
yeah
course, like none of those things are actually doing that.
no
Yeah.
right
So the other funny thing I want to quickly mention on hydrogen, if it's okay,
yeah
is I'm not sure if you watched. I'm not sure if you watched Glass Onion. Have you seen that?
yes of
Yeah.
course there's the miracle hydrogen fuel nugget
Yeah. Like the actual story, like the actual like detail, like of course the stuff in the movie is ridiculous, right? Like you're not gonna
yeah
like that's just physically not a particularly a real thing. But I loved the story of basically the silver bullet wonder fuel, right? Like the
yeah
sort of
yeah
rich tech billionaire, the media narrative of like, wow, this person's a hero, they're sort of solving
yeah
climate change on their own. And then of course the reality, which is that they haven't really thought it through. And
yeah
I'm not going to spoil anything about the
no
movie, because I would love, if your listeners haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it.
it is
It's
brilliant.
it's
No, I
such a
loved
great
it. I
movie.
loved it. Yeah.
But basically, it skewers. I really loved it. I really loved that movie because like it's just a well-made movie, but also it's so fun to have a movie that actually makes like it has a bit of a satirical dig at climate solutions in what I think
Yes.
is a potentially like not a destructive way, because you could end up going down a bad road where a movie's like all climate solutions are stupid and like you shouldn't listen
Yeah.
to any of it, but it kind of like narrowly focuses on one subset, which I thought was, yeah, it's pretty fun.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, go watch it if you haven't watched it yet, listeners.
Yeah. But I mean, I think I think it is a shame in a way that because in a perfect world, no, there's no such thing as perfect. In a better world, carbon capture and storage would work, and it would help. If it worked, it would
Mm,
help. There's no argument there. If you're burning coal because you've got no alternative at that time, and you capture all the CO2 that's coming out of the chimney and scrub it clean, that's better than not doing it.
mm,
You know, and,
yeah.
and then you store that carbon. In the same way, I'd rather be, if I'm cycling along a road and a hydrogen powered bus overtakes me rather than a diesel bus, I'm happier. But it's
Yeah.
still,
Yeah,
when you see
definitely.
that, yeah. But I mean, what would be
Yeah.
much better is if it was an electric bus that doesn't need any liquid fuel transporting to make it run.
Yeah.
You can, that is starting to happen. And we're seeing that in Sydney. The Sydney Bus Company in your city has now got loads of electric
Yeah.
buses that are charged off a huge solar array that's on the roof of the depot. And you go, with that, please, can we
That's
have
so
more of that?
cool.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh, that makes me happy. Just a quick
yeah,
side note on that. If
yeah,
while you're there, if you could get a bus company to get an electric bus going between Sydney and Canberra, That bus company
Oh,
would make $1 billion trillion, I suspect.
yeah.
Just like all the people who take that flight who don't want to, because the
Right.
airports are awful experiences
Yeah.
and
It's a
they don't want
horrible
to have the
experience. Yeah.
emissions. And you could have like, a decent bus, like, and just make it electric. Let's electric
A
buses.
luxury
Like,
coach, because I don't know how far it is. How many k is it to drive from Sydney to Canberra? But it's not that far. But it's
I,
probably, I don't know
I,
what it is.
it was like a 3.5-ish hour drive in my little
Oh,
car
so
when I
it's
did it, I think
probably
previously.
not more than 200k then. I mean, it's not that far.
I don't know if there are
There's got to
buses
be.
that
It's got
can
to be possible. Oh,
it's got to
well, yeah,
be.
you
There's got
could
to
make
be.
one that does. Yeah, you could make one that could do it.
That
Such a
company
good
would
idea.
make an infinite amount of
Yeah,
money if they if they
yeah.
did that.
Why don't
Because
we?
people are
Why don't
so
we?
keen to not do that plane trip.
Why
Let's
don't
do
we
it.
set up? Let's set up a company and build a really cool bus that can do that. No, it would be. I mean, that's the thing. Where I'm staying at the moment, I'm in Spring Hill in Brisbane, and I think it's it's not a wealthy area, but it's quite a hip, cool area of Brisbane. I don't think it's a
Yeah.
poor area. I mean, it's a mix, but it's mixed. But when I look out of our bedroom window at a load of roofs, we're up a slight hill. We're looking down on every single house. I cannot see one that doesn't have either quite a lot of solar or a staggering amount of solar on the roof. They all
Yeah.
do. There's not one house around here. And
That's
the
awesome.
building I'm in uses no grid power at all. It has enough battery storage and solar to make that plausible. It's
Oh
a
wow.
small single. It's a single bedroom unit. That's like a little apartment built in the back of a house.
Yeah,
But
cool.
and it's quite
Can I
new. But
just
I mean, that
quickly
is yeah.
if I could just quickly loop back, I wanted to quickly mention something because it was really
Oh,
important what you
good.
said
Yeah.
about 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 wouldn't it be nice if CCS had worked?
Right.
And
Yes.
with so many decades, like with so many decades into it now, that it feels like
Yeah.
all of the problems have been cemented really deep, right? So
Right.
the
Right.
cultural problems and the sort of rhetorical, like I mentioned, fossil fuel companies constantly using it, it's been cemented so deep. And CCS is physically attached to the cause of the problem, right? So it's like
Yes.
it's a unit, it's a machine that is generally owned by the same people who are producing fossil fuels to sell or
Yeah.
burning them to
Yeah.
generate electrical power, right?
Yeah.
However, one thing that we need to be really keep in mind is carbon. I mentioned carbon removal at the start of this call, right? So it's like there's technological alternatives, right? So you can have like a fan that just sucks out ambient air, and then it does this
Yeah.
process to basically remove the carbon from that air.
Yeah.
And then you can take that carbon, pipe it into an underground reservoir, like even depleted oil and gas reservoirs. You can pump carbon back into them. It takes a lot of energy.
Yeah.
It's a very expensive process at the moment, but it's still not the worst thing to do, right? Like it's
Yeah.
the same as building a solar panel, building a solar farm that helps a coal-fired power station get shut down. You end up with less
Yeah.
carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. However, there is what we should really pay attention to this year, and I hope your listeners can, keep an eye out for this because it's going to be a really interesting phenomenon. Is who buys that carbon removal, right? So let's just say you have like this,
Right.
like there's a company called Cleanworks,
Yeah.
based in
Yeah.
Iceland. You would have seen some of their stuff, right? Like they're doing
Yeah.
pretty good demonstration projects for carbon removal. It would be a disaster if they then said, "Okay, we've done all that carbon removal. Now we're going to sell carbon credits to Shell, who can then use it to
Right.
justify their ongoing emissions." But they're
Yeah.
not doing that, right? Like they made a point of saying, "No, we're not going to sell to any fossil fuel companies."
Right.
So what I don't want is in 10 years' time for us to go like, oh, carbon removal could have worked, but it's
Could have
ended
worked. It
up
could
in
have been
this
so
awful
good.
situation. Yeah. But it could potentially actually do well as long as it avoids that problem of becoming something that like the fossil fuel industry just uses to be like, oh, don't worry about our gas-fired power station because we're buying carbon removal credits. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
and they don't even bother building the damn thing, and it just ends up in
Yeah.
this constant cycle of like CCS, carbon removal hype, and then no hype, and that's not good, right? Like we don't want that.
Yeah.
We want actually
Yeah.
have like decent, but it has to be completely unlinked from
Yeah.
all the people who have really nasty intentions and who would love to use it for like basically marketing purposes, to
Yeah.
worsen climate change.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just, keep an eye out for like the news, and like 2023 is going to be a really big year for that type of thing, to see which way it goes.
Right. Yes.
But
Yes.
hopefully it goes in the right direction.
But then one of the things I've noticed here, so I haven't been here for coming up for 5 years since I last came to Australia. So it's for about 4.5 years since I was last here. Is, I mean, a really, really noticeable, marked increase in electric vehicles on the road. So that I was really surprised, because there were some, in trendy, rich suburbs of Sydney, you'd see quite a few Teslas last time I was here. Brisbane is full of Teslas, absolutely brimming,
Yeah.
overflowing with. There's so many of them. They've sold so many cars here, but also you're really starting to see a lot more Chinese imports, and we know about that. My sister-in-law has a BYD Atto 3 car. That she's one of the first people to have it, and it's a really nice little car. But that's like that's irrelevant to what I'm saying, because I just wondered if what your attitude about, or your opinion of the new or newish administration is, because the thing that really caught my ear when immediately after the election was teals, and I'd never heard of this before. So I went, oh, what are
Yeah.
teals? I googled teal, Australian. What is an Australian teal? But I mean, I'm getting quite mixed messages from the people I'm meeting here and talking to, who work in those fields. In the sort of electrification of transport, renewable energy, facilitating more, community-based transport systems and all that stuff. I mean, it's clearly this government is much more sympathetic to that sort of discussion than the previous one.
Yeah.
The previous one only wanted fossil fuels, didn't it? But I can't quite read it.
Cynical old Ketan. My instincts has always been, I don't have any political allegiances, right? Like if the Greens were in government, I would be yelling at them just as much as I yell at the Labour Party or the Liberal Party in Australia, right? So my first instinct has always been, a bit of a critical perspective, I would say. So basically, before they won government in May last year, in May. Wait, no, it was last year. Sorry, May 2022.
Yeah, it was last year.
They released a climate policy, and they had a transport subsection in it. And their target for emissions reductions in transport was only like a small fraction lower than what was projected to happen anyway by the government's environment department. So it was not ambitious, right? It was really just not very good. So I haven't published the piece on this yet. So this is a bit of like forward sizzle. Maybe by the time this podcast comes out, I'll have published something. Maybe not. But you know what? I'm going to spoil it anyway. So they released new projections last year, right? So the Australian government now has an electric vehicle policy, where they want to use a collection of, I think it's a rebate, and maybe some reductions in the tax burden on new purchases, a little sort of Norway-esque type thing, to incentivize the purchase of new electric vehicles, which is, that's not bad. They're doing something. Like, it's gonna, like, I saw that announcement and I was like, well, hypothetically, that'll lead to more reductions than just business as usual. Like, it's some ambition. Good on them. But two complicated and interesting things happened with the last projections, right? So the first thing that happened is, obviously, like, this is my theory. So I'm not, I'm kind of just basing this on my own instinct, and understanding of like these departments. But probably what had been happening under the previous government is that they were actually overestimating the deployment of EVs in their projections, into up to 2030, and then like basically juicing the projections so they could say, don't worry, about our lack of policies. Like, the projections show we're going to do really well anyway. They were probably juicing those a bit, using some funky assumptions about EVs, and also calculating transport emissions in a funky way. So what has actually happened last year, in December last year, they published these new projections, and the new government is like, look, we found all these really weird assumptions in this projection for EVs
Right.
and for transport emissions in Australia, and we've corrected them. And the consequence of that correction is that it's actually a worse prognosis for both EV deployment and for
Right.
transport emissions compared to the previous government. So
Wow.
it's not their fault, right? Like they're not even factoring their policy into that projection. So they're a very fresh government. They only, were elected in May last year. They're still consulting on their EV policy, I think. And so nothing's been implemented yet. And so what actually happens? So the second interesting thing that happened is they're also factoring in supply chain limitations and potential increases in cost into their projections, which also unfortunately results in a slightly worse prognosis for transport and EVs. Neither of which, again, the government has any say on, right? So the government, I was gonna my first instinct when I produced these charts was like, oh, this would be a great thing to yell at them for because everything's so much worse. But then I looked at the reasons and I was like, well, they're not really I shouldn't yell at them for this thing specifically. However, what it should entail is they should have looked at those projections and gone, oh no, oh gosh, that's really, really bad. We now need to ramp up our transport and EV policies, right? We need to take a step further. We need to introduce some fuel standards. We need to set a deadline for combustion engine sale, like the cessation of combustion engine sales. We need to, have some sort of federal government support for state and local level public and active transport policies. We need to do all these extra things because it's such a bad situation with our transport emissions. And none of that is happening, right? They're kind of just coasting off on the there's certainly a heavy focus on EVs and EV sales, but there's not a lot of focus on the consequential change in transport emissions and whether or not that's fast enough. So like you mentioned the teals, for instance, they're fantastic, right? Like they've had such an amazingly positive effect on Australian climate policy. Obviously, they played a huge role in that election, in helping the Labor Party get elected, in taking seats away from the Liberal Party, and also just having people in Parliament who are there making, who are putting pressure even on the Labor Party to have climate policies that are much more aligned with 1.5C. However, they do tend to be a little bit product centric, maybe a little bit more focused on the consumer benefits of EVs, which of course are very real and very significant. Whereas, now where the Labor Party need to go is they need to take a step further, because EVs of course are already very popular in Australia, right? Like, as you say, anyone who can buy them is absolutely buying them. There's you don't really need much more pressure. You don't need to convince people, right? Like they already know for sure. Now what we need is actually a bit more pressure in the system, right? A bit more government intervention to actually get those projections heading in the right direction and get, Australia's transport emissions forecasted to fall. Like, they're not forecasted to fall at the moment up to 2030, and they need to be. And then also some stuff I think last time we talked, I was full of extreme criticism of the previous government. And of course, they basically caused a 10-year stagnation in Australia's emissions, which is catastrophic. They're not good people. However, one of the very, very few good things that they did was a good research system. A research and incentivization system for long distance electrification and transport. So trucks and buses and goods transport, stuff like that. Of course, they were doing that because they wanted to look like they were doing something while avoiding the bigger the bigger questions. But it's still a good it's still a pretty good thing to have, right? Because Australia has a lot of course, big wide country, has a lot of transport
Yeah.
emissions from just trucks going across the
From
country,
trucks.
and they need to
Yeah.
be
God. Yeah.
they need to be something, they need to be electrified,
Yeah.
or if hydrogen is suitable, that could be used.
Yeah.
So basically, Australia is in. There hasn't been much discussion about those projections, which is why I'm
Right.
really keen to write about them, because it actually
Yeah.
highlights a looming problem for Australia's EV deployment, which has its own momentum now, which is fantastic, but needs more momentum to get where it needs to be in the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bit of a spoiler
No,
there
you're
for you for my
yeah.
post.
No, no, that's really very kind of you to share that, preempt that. But I mean, that was, what the counter to the thing that I've noticed, just driving around Australia, you just see a lot more electric vehicles. But that is to balance that, the sheer number of huge, heavy, massively overpowered SUVs and utes, pickup trucks in Australia. It's so easy to forget that when you're not here, and then you get, you kind of come out of the airport and something drives past you that is the size of a house, and there's one person in it at the wheel. It's a monster thing with tires bigger than a swimming pool. It was just crazy. And you go, there's
Oh my
so
gosh.
many. They are so popular.
This
Those
was one.
huge gas guzzling monsters.
Yeah. Certainly, the increase in SUV sales has been cancelling out the whatever sort of new deployment of EVs. Not that you can really cancel it out, because any reduction is that's a real reduction.
Yes.
But still, you want to have falling emissions. You don't want to have rising emissions. And so this is one really interesting cultural difference that I've noticed, particularly playing in social media spaces, both when Australia is awake and when Europe is awake,
Right.
is that talking about the social harm, the sort of the damage that's done to a society or a city or a suburb by very large vehicles is much more acceptable in Europe than it is in Australia. People are very quick to defend.
It's more acceptable in Europe. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
To talk about those things, I think is obviously cities are very different in Europe than they are in Australia.
Oh, sorry. It is. Are you saying it's more acceptable to discuss those ideas in a European setting than it is here?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
yes,
definitely.
I can imagine that's
the impression.
Sorry. Yes.
I mean, so because I talk about it, and my Australian friends will just immediately start coming up with these sort of clear half-hearted justifications where it's oh no, it's safety, and I need to transport my kids' stuff to childcare, and to some degree there's actually a bit of truth to, particularly when people talk about being locked into relying on cars due to the infrastructure in cities in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes
that's
sense.
certainly true.
Yeah.
You don't need a tank.
No.
That's not true. So one interesting thing to note, actually, just in relation to what we were just talking about, is the tire. Do you know the tire extinguishers? Have you heard of these?
Yes,
this group?
yes. Because they were busy. They were busy in the UK before I left.
Yeah, and for the first time recently, they actually had a little cell form in Australia. I think it was in Sydney, actually.
Right.
They went around to some inner city, the area in Sydney, the sort of towards the eastern side, near the beaches, where it's you've got these tiny streets, and then you've got a massive these huge vehicles on these tiny streets. Always the shiny black 4-wheel drive that's never been out in the dirt. And so they went there, and actually, very interestingly, a few people who were associated with the Teal politicians actually made a point of saying, no, we sort of decry this type of activism or this action because it's alienating people who support the cause, and it could impact someone who needs to use their car. And I just found that a really interesting sociological phenomenon, because those Teal politicians actually tend to be in those areas where that whole issue of consumer decisions and like ethical decisions about the city or the suburb that you live in, they're really hard discussions to have. And I think there's actually a potential for some of those politicians to take a lead and kind of do it in a way that actually talks to those people from like in a familiar way where they're coming from. It's kind of saying like, wouldn't it be great, for our suburb and our society and like air pollution and stuff like that if we started choosing smaller cars?
Yes, yeah.
But it's not really something that you see a lot of. Like they're kind of more likely to focus on EVs, or they're kind of a bit more likely to focus on, make your next car purchase electric or something like that. So,
right.
there could be a really good thing. They could be like, make your next car a small EV. I hope they.
What will actually happen?
What
will actually happen is, what will actually happen is make your next car an electric Hummer.
Yeah,
the biggest, heaviest car. Or a Cybertruck. No, that is, Ketan, it's just amazing to catch up with you as always. It's a real joy. I've got as you can see, it's now dark in Australia. It's now nighttime, but we ought to find it up there. But I'm really hoping that I will get to see you this year somewhere, either Amsterdam or there is quite a big chance of me coming to Oslo. So that's, I am coming to Oslo.
Cool.
I've just remembered. So I'll let you know about all that.
Great.
I'm definitely coming to Oslo later this year. So let's do lunch.
Yeah, let's do
it. It's been really good talking to you, really good catching up with you. I mean, a fascinating take on so much stuff there. I could talk to you for hours, but let's leave it there, and we'll get you back on the show soon.
Thank you for having me on.